So today we're going to talk about task analysis, but I thought it was a good moment to kind of reflect on what we've done so far, because we have, what is all the ding donging?
People are arriving. You're a co-host.
Oh, all right. Ding dong. Welcome, everyone.
I'll make you not a co-host till people get in.
It's a bit like trick or treat, kind of. I'm already getting in the mood. So yeah, let's first talk a little bit more about where we are. And also I would love to talk a bit more about your key takeaways so far, because, you know, I think when you look at the learning path, there's a lot in there to process and to connect the dots and whatever. So I would love to hear your thoughts. And then we're going to dive into our feedback delivery theme, our topic, and then Matt and I are going to demo task analysis. So Matt is going to be my stakeholder today. It's a very nice stakeholder, so I'm really lucky. And we can just have conversations throughout, because yeah, there's plenty of time for that. So first, let's talk a little bit more about what we've done so far and where we are. So what we're trying to do with this whole learning path is to really you know, think through how to design for these really complex interventions, and that's both from a learning perspective and from a stakeholder management, organizational, political perspective. So it is really, really complex, right? It's basically everything that we do in our job, which is a bit much to tackle in a learning path, but you know, we like to be a bit ambitious. But at the moment we are, so we talked in the previous weeks about more like the stakeholder management and the intake, and of course the stakeholder management, you know, is woven in throughout the whole learning path. But we started to talk a little bit more about, you know, how you initially engage with your stakeholders, how you gather their initial like thinking and understanding their rationale, and understanding kind of like the political place. And now we're moving into more like the needs analysis from a problem statement, root cause analysis, moving towards thinking about this, what then the best solution is. So today we're really focusing more on the learning design process, because we're going to dive into task analysis, and of course the politics keep playing a role. We can't just ignore that. I would almost say unfortunately, but that is what it is. So again, what we've discussed so far of stakeholder management, we've talked about problem identification, we've talked about root cause analysis, we've talked about associated performance gaps, and the 4 boxes based on Gilbert. So I actually had to think about that a little bit myself, because so when we look at, sorry, Claire, I stole your quote there because I loved it. Because this is usually the case, right? Woof, there's so many issues here. Where are we even going to start? So I hope you don't mind. I saw it and I really loved it. It's just so relevant. So when we think about Gilbert's boxes, right? So this is very useful at the point where you start to make sense out of all the data that you've gathered, understanding the problem. So then when you watch Matt's video on Blinkit, he is then zooming in on our theme, which is performance management. So we just, for everybody to be aware of that, he's using that as an example in the video. I just wanted to point that out. But when we zoom out again, you know, just to be aware that you can use the 4 boxes for any performance issue, right? So it's the video was an example, but just to be aware. So I gave one example for each box here. And then when we think about the knowledge, skills and abilities and attitudes that Matt also talked about, then that is when we dive a little bit deeper and start to think about what is causing the gap, right? And then the examples below that are more for you to consider, okay, what type of solutions are then best to fill that performance gap? So I just wanted to kind of summarize that, because I think it was quite a lot of information and not necessarily easy to all connect the dots. But that might have just been me. But I just hope that it's that it makes sense. And I would like to know from you guys. So this is my question. Like, how have you experienced it so far? What are your key takeaways? So I kind of want to open up the mic and kind of reflect on what we've done so far, your questions, your concerns. Am I still sharing? Oh, okay, because I don't see that like bar around it. So anybody who wants to start, like, yeah, what is this learning path doing for you so far, or what is it not doing that you were actually hoping for, or things you might have tried out? I don't really, it's more an open question.
What I found out that I wasn't doing was taking into consideration all the stakeholders. Like I've implicated the person from whom the request came and their direct manager, but I never thought about what other stakeholders I should include in the process. So that's new for me.
And so did that help you? Like, did it make sense to you when you thought about it in the context of your product? You were like, oh yeah, now that I think about it, it's actually really important to have these people involved. Or
it will be for next year, because that training will be useful for me next year. Because we have a massive project of sales onboarding and continuous training, and we have a lot of stakeholders that are scattered throughout the organization, different countries and different focus. So that's going to be important for me to gather all that information before we actually design the training. Well, I said training singular, but it's not singular, the training path.
The program, yeah. Yes. Okay, thank you. That's really good.
On that note, Mirjam, it's Raoul here. And what Claire was just talking about, I the stakeholders, it's never very apparent. So once I get in, I start using interest influence grid. So I start looking for the people with high interest and high influence and start mapping them, there. So the people with the really high interest, the really high influence, these are the people that I start focusing on, start delineating between all the stakeholders, because not all stakeholders are equal in this process.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point.
And those are the ones that are going to support you also in establishing a correct learning path.
And as you're training, let's say it goes over a period of time, someone who had little interest but a lot of influence suddenly morphs into high interest, high influence. So it changes, over the time and the impact of the program potentially.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I remember that type of situations where they showed very little interest for a long time until everything was almost done. And then suddenly they parachute in and I'm like, what about this? How about that? Like, where were you like in the last 6 months?
If you don't mind, another comment just from me, just going back to Gilbert's, or this adapted from Gilbert's slide. I don't see measurement in there, Mirjam. I mean, is that deliberately missed out? I was just wondering, under tools and resources, perhaps in terms of looking at the performance gap, that measurement should be a consideration of how we are going to look at impact.
Okay, that's a really good point. So because, and Matt, jump in if I'm saying something that because these boxes are not about us and what we're trying to achieve. These boxes are about the performance problem. And so you're gathering all the data from your stakeholders around what the problem is that you're solving, and you plot that into these boxes. So this is about the work. This is not about what we are trying to achieve or how we can measure impact. Yeah. Really good question. And I think that this is sometimes where not just us, but also our stakeholders can sometimes confuse the two, because they're so heavily focused on their own solution that they keep talking about the solution, while in reality, we first have to focus on the work. So to me, I've always joked that in my previous job, that was my only job, to keep people to keep pulling people back to yeah, but what are we trying to achieve when it comes to the work? What is it? So I think that is something that we need to keep front and center. Anybody else, like any key takeaways or questions or concerns or?
So I'll add a key takeaway, and it has to do with all the mistakes I made when I moved in my career from doing more simple to more complex. You know, related to what we've talked about before, the stakeholder map gets more complicated, right? And you have to figure out. So I would just say it's about being intentional about what your lens is. Where are you working in the organization? And which functions are involved in making sure kind of you're using that organizational structure, both the formal and informal one, to figure out if you've got the right groups of people and if you're aiming your intervention at the right level, you know, to get the right sponsors, to get the right participation, to make sure that you're going to get maintenance and sustainability on the other side when you're done. If you scope it too small and just involve the wrong groups of people, you can't be successful long term.
Yeah, that's a really good point. What I also find sometimes is that I sometimes think that people are stakeholders that then nobody else like mentions. But I'm like, yeah, but it's really for these people and they don't seem to have a say like whatsoever. So I think that's sometimes also difficult to manage. That the stakeholders are not always necessarily the one from, in this case, my perspective, that should have the biggest say, if that makes sense.
Yeah, we encounter that a lot, Mirjam, where like when a project is brought to us, those folks aren't thinking broadly enough about who the stakeholder groups are. And so a bit of a mantra that we have in our own L&D team is, let's take the lead on being the ones who think through who all needs to be involved, and let's be the champions of inclusivity in that regard to make sure we don't miss anyone. Because yeah, I mean, I think other parts of the organization often, I don't know, work in siloed ways where they don't have the training and experience to think about that broad kind of cross-functional collaboration. But of course, being in L&D, none of our initiatives exist in this silo. We are necessarily collaborative. So I think we're really well positioned to be the ones who take the lead on thinking through that process and, you know, really kind of own making those connections.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Here, I'm just looking at the chat. Yeah, I agree. It's a lot, says Andrew. Yeah, I agree too.
I guess
maybe
that's
sorry,
the thing.
go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Rahul. Go ahead.
No, go
I'll
ahead,
go
Andrew. Go ahead. Oh,
I guess the thing I'm struggling with, and maybe I'm trying to be not thinking about it in its proper concept, is the root cause. The idea of you're identifying a problem, you're trying to find the root cause, but is the root cause necessarily something that's like a one-to-one relationship? Like we've got the problem, we've got the root cause, or can it be a root cause is a one-to-many relationship? And that's where I'm really, I think I need to stop trying to be so narrow about it and maybe just accept that there's going to be root cause that can be a root cause to many other issues, as opposed to just being one, or it's going to depend. And I'm really trying to grapple with that a little bit more, I think, with this, as well as we talk about identifying the problems and, you know, what the root cause are. Like, how can I define that?
Really good point, Andrew, because I think, you know, isn't that also where the systems thinking and the, you know, like there's often multiple and they're strongly interrelated, but it's almost impossible to untangle and really understand what's causing what, you know. So I think that's really complex.
Just on Praka's note about change management, maybe there's also some thinking about post the intervention. Who's going to take ownership for the performance? So that stakeholder might be different from the people you used at the very beginning. So somebody needs to follow it through.
Yeah. Now we're making it even more complex. But yeah, it's all true. Does anybody have any questions so far, or based on what you've done in the asynchronous parts? I think that people are speaking up there, so we'll probably all right, so let's dive into the feedback delivery then. So how this works is we are going to zoom in now. So we have our topic, we have complex skills. Don't worry about that too much, because we're going to dive into what complex skills are in the next week. We're just going to assume now that there is something called complex skills, and then the tasks. So let's assume that based on our conversations with Charles and some other stakeholders, we now know, for example, that the team is not hitting goals consistently. And although overall people seem to know how to do their jobs, expectations around performance are not clear, and people don't always see the value of what they do. So without going into the details, just because yeah, that would make it even more complex. Our analysis so far suggests that we do need to look at the performance management, as in that is definitely part of the problem. And in particular, we need to look into feedback delivery. So we do think we now understand, we're confident enough that we understand what our problem is and also what the root cause is. And now we're going to convert that problem in our minds as an overarching topic, which is then management. And the complex skill is then performance management. And then the complex skill consists of various tasks, and we're only going to focus on one, which is the feedback delivery. So in order to understand what feedback delivery is as a task, what it means as a task, we need to conduct a task analysis. So let's start thinking about that. And first, I want to ask you what you think is the purpose of a task analysis. So either just put in a chat or open up the mic. But what is the purpose of a task analysis?
I think of it as including what someone needs to recognize, make a decision about, and then do something effectively about what they recognize and decide.
Okay. So it sounds like we're talking about something that has to do with the work that they're doing.
Yeah.
So I see benchmark how things are done, define the work in detail for successful performance. Sorry, I'm kind of scrolling up and down. Map out the content that we're dealing with, define what good looks like in the performance of work that results in a product, service, or decision. Ooh, very precise, Dawn. Very good. Map out the content, identify what the goal is, how it's expected to be done. So that is also in line with what you were saying, Rich, about decision making. What's currently being done by the learner and the gap between expectation and actual work done. Okay, let's keep this one in mind. Determine what skills need to be learned and what it should look like, how it should be done. Yeah. Okay, so yes, you kind of nailed it. So it is really about the when we think about in our case feedback delivery, it is about what does good feedback delivery look like in the context of, you know, the various scenarios in which feedback can be delivered in the context of performance management. So it's about identifying the steps required to complete a task, clarifying the required outcomes. So I've seen deliverable already in the chat, and understanding the enablers as well. So what is it that people need to be able to do that thing successfully? Dawn, you started a discussion about this in the chat a little bit, and I see that Claire's point kind of points out that that this distinction might not be necessarily clear enough, because the task analysis is really about understanding how the task should be done competently, right? So this is about what we're trying to achieve. And then Claire, what you were pointing out, I need to scroll up again about what you were saying exactly, about like what's current, like the gap, like, so about what's currently done by the learner, that has more to do with a needs analysis and or user research. So you need both, but the task analysis is really about what good looks like. So that you understand, you know, when you think about your learning experience, like what people in the end need to be able to achieve and what that looks like, what good looks like. So this is a partnership between the learning designer, learning professional working with master performers. And I use the term master performers consciously because I'm trying to distinguish, and I've learned this from both Guy Wallace and Dick Clark, that you need to distinguish between people who might know a lot about the work, such as subject matter experts or very senior people who might have done it in the past, versus master performers who are actually now currently in the moment good at performing that work. So for task analysis, preferably you work with the latter. You work with people like with master performers, people are good at the task at hand now. So note that there's some overlap, right, with Gilbert's boxes, as in there also we talk about things like knowledge and attitudes, like when we did the KAAs, like let me just go back just to kind of like do. Sorry. So you know, here you also see tools and resources, for example, and when we look about the KAAs that are KSAAs that are under the boxes, that's also has some overlap. However, this is more like Gilbert's boxes and the KSA are more about the higher level performance problem still and the gap, while with the task analysis we're really diving into the more granular level, as in the work in its actual context. So here you can kind of see when we think about the enablers. So here you can see, you know, you break down the complex skill performance management into the major responsibility, feedback delivery, and then you can have different steps slash activities to get there, and each activity or task has different enablers. So here you can see some examples for each. I'm just going to take a look at the chat. Okay, cool. Right. So I just want to kind of point out why a task analysis is so critical to do, is because when we want to design effective solutions, we really need to understand the whole task. And that is because if we don't do that, and if we start to design for all the separate elements that make up a task and teach people these separate elements, then we're using what we call a fragmented approach. And that, in other words, we might teach the dots, but we don't help people to connect the dots. So that makes it really hard for people. I actually see this a lot, where we teach topics and we don't help people understand how all these topics, what they have to do with each other and how they connect in the context of the work. And we kind of expect people to do that themselves. And that is just not fair. Matt.
I just want to add, one of the things that I got a lot out of talking to Mirjam, watching Mirjam's videos and the work she does with Paul and on her own, was distinguishing between tasks and competencies. Like competency-based models are often confused with the work that we're talking about here. In fact, profiles of competencies that vendors can provide you. This is not what we're talking about. And just in case your head was thinking this is the same kind of thing, competency-based modeling is not what we're distinguishing here around task analysis or thinking about it in the context of complex skills or complex learning programs. In fact, I don't think either of us are in favor of competency-based modeling.
Well, I mean, I always think about this more like, you know, frameworks like that can be helpful at a more abstract level you can feed like bottom-up data that is contextual into these more abstract frameworks that kind of help you make sense at things like at a, you know, in the bigger picture. I actually have a lot of conversations at the moment as well in my organization where, you know, because skills-based organization, you know, skills, you know, they're flying around. But then when you actually look at what a skill is in the context of the work, usually it's actually not a skill. It's a task that then consists of multiple skills, knowledge elements, attitudinal things, you know, like it is usually in the context of, especially when you were like in a knowledge heavy organization, we usually are dealing with complex skills. And I really think that people don't realize, especially the business, when they think, yeah, we need better strategical thinking and that's the skill that they're then focusing on. Well, okay, but what does that mean in the context of the work? Well, then actually the strategic thinking becomes an enabler for the other thing, which is then actually the task, right? This is what people need to achieve. So this is the constant pattern that I now start to see. Yeah,
that's a really good example. I tend to think leadership profiles or leadership competencies are so far out there and generic and useless that this is way more useful for us to start to break down what are the complex skills and what are the tasks associated with those skills. That enables us to build a leadership curriculum that's way more useful if leadership was our vague objective.
Yeah. And yes, Dawn, completely agree with your point there. Yeah, I think we are in general in many organizations we are very focused on, you know, scalable solutions and efficiency and stuff like that. But then in the end, what that leads to often is quite shallow solutions that don't necessarily add that much value when it comes to helping people to improve what they do on the job. Is my modest opinion.
Sorry for interrupting.
No, you are more than welcome to interrupt. Okay, so let's do a you know, play around a bit with this. I am going to I need to work on my Zoom skills because I constantly get lost in this whole. Okay, I'm gonna stop share. Let's see if I can find this. Because I need to move to my Miro board now. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing for a bit.
You're hearing me complain about Teams earlier in the week.
Okay, let's see. I'm just laughing about the chat. I am recognizable. Okay, so Matt Richter, you are can we see this the Miro board or not yet?
Yeah, we can. And folks, if you make your window bigger, you can actually scale it to make it even bigger for you.
Yeah, I'm going to zoom in, so don't worry about it. So this is my my template. It's not very pretty, but it needs to be somewhat flexible because a task analysis is usually somewhat messy. So what I've done, just to kind of walk you through, so this here is the complex skill, performance management, right? then the major responsibility one, I mean, it's of course not necessarily number one, it's just a number, the one that we're talking about today, is feedback delivery. And then the output, I need to work with that with my stakeholder. So I'm just going to kick off the conversation with my stakeholder. So Matt, thank you so much for making time today. What we're going to do is, so I have understood that you are one of the best people in our organization when it comes to feedback delivery. What in the context of giving feedback to your team, that has been very consistent feedback, that you're very good at delivering feedback. So what I would like to do is talk a little bit more about what it takes to give somebody good feedback. And the first thing, and this is not necessarily an easy question, so don't worry if your answer might not be perfect. We can shape it later. But would you be able to articulate for me, like, when feedback is done well, like what is the outcome of that? Like what, when we talk about a deliverable, and that's a bit weird in the context of feedback delivery, but in your own words, like when you deliver effective feedback, what's the outcome of that? What's the output?
I don't think it's a weird question at all. I think there is or should be a deliverable whenever someone gives feedback. And the deliverable is a change in behavior in the recipient of that feedback. And that change in behavior can be continue doing what they're doing well, build on it, or it could be change what they're doing poorly towards something that's better. So there is a measurable deliverable.
Okay, yeah. So the deliverable always depends on the person you give feedback to, right?
Yeah.
The deliverable is always in the context of their work.
Yeah.
Or the performance. Yeah, the performance. Is that how you would word it? Okay.
Exactly. You should see continued good improvement, or I'm sorry, good performance, or you should see something fixed to make the current performance better.
Okay. I'm just going to leave it. So what we're going to do first, so when you look at the light blue stickies here, first we're going to talk about the steps that you take to get to effective feedback. So we're going to dive in deeper later, but first we're going to talk about steps.
Okay.
So what's the very first thing when you think about delivering effective feedback? What is the very first thing you need to do?
First, determine what your feedback is about. So, did you observe something that needs to be fixed or that needs to be reinforced? Don't just give feedback willy-nilly. That's a technical term.
Okay, so that's the very first thing. So, okay, hold on a second. Okay, so that's the very first thing. I just wonder now if this is actually the second thing, but you tell me. It looks to me that there's a step before this, namely you need to be able to determine what your feedback is about based on something else.
Yeah, I think this gets tricky because feedback is usually embedded within something, right? Whether I'm coaching or I'm project managing or right? It's usually feedback is contextual to something that I'm already doing. And if I think about feedback as separate from something, then you're right. There is probably something that stimulates me to think about that there should be some feedback. But in general, if I'm coaching someone, managing them through a project, delegating to them, then this analysis of figuring out what it is the feedback should be about should be embedded in that bigger process.
All right, so what's the next step then? So first you have to determine what your feedback is about, and then what?
Determine what I want them to do differently. And that differently might be, don't do it differently, do the same thing. Keep
Okay.
doing it, focus on it, keep doing it, right? So determine what I want them to do is probably more accurate.
Okay. And then the next step?
Then decide if this is significant. If I just, hey, Mirjam, I would urge you to wear blue instead of red. This is an insignificant piece of feedback. This is not going to help your performance. It's not going to help us do what we want done. So you need to make sure your feedback is worthy.
All right.
And I think that's a really important step. I think too many people give stupid feedback.
Right. Let's talk about that later. So I'm going to pause here for a sec because I just want to point out that I'm going to stop here at the higher level because, in reality, you would continue this questioning until you feel that you have all the steps. And I just tripped over something, right? Because when I said it feels like there's something before this first step, I was actually thinking one level deeper. So I was thinking about this level, like the skills, knowledge, and mindset, because what I was thinking when I asked that question was, should you not be aware of somebody's goals or the expectations or whatever? But that is then the knowledge that enables this first step. So I realized my own mistake, so I stopped pushing for it. But this will happen, right? And that's why I'm pointing it out, because you are not the subject matter expert, right? So you will ask stupid questions, you will make wrong assumptions, you will give wrong summaries. So I didn't do that this time, but I warn the people that I work with that that's going to happen. And it needs to be done that way, because otherwise you can't get to a good product.
And I'm not even sure I'd characterize it as a mistake. Part of it is, especially if you don't know the topic, you don't sometimes even know if you're zooming in or zooming out until you get more information. And so part of it is triangulating toward what the right level is.
Yeah, exactly. That's true. In this case, I know a little bit about this, and that might be the most dangerous place to be in, right? Because then you're starting to make assumptions.
Just
while if we were talking about like how to manage a nuclear plant, I probably wouldn't make any assumptions because I literally have no clue, right? So okay, so let's move on to the next step, because we only have like 15 minutes left, and I do want to have space to have conversations as well. And feel free to interrupt, right, if you have questions or if you don't understand why I'm doing something. Okay, so Matt, you have just told me that the very first step is that you need to determine what your feedback is about. So when you think about somebody who, let me rephrase. What do you need to be able to do to be able to determine what your feedback is about?
Well, I need to know what they're doing. I have to have a basic understanding. I don't have to be an expert in it, but I need to have a basic understanding of the process, of the procedures, the principles that they're using to do whatever they're doing.
Okay, so that's the knowledge about what the potential feedback receiver is doing.
Right. Otherwise, how do I know what to give them feedback on? I don't have to be a subject matter expert, but I need to be familiar enough to give them hopefully an objective perspective.
And do you only need to know what they're doing sounds a bit abstract to me. So can you elaborate a bit? Like, what does that mean?
You mean like give you an example?
Well, I mean, what they're doing, they're probably doing many different things, right? They're doing a job. So
let's say I'm coaching them on giving a presentation to an executive team. Mm-hmm. So I need to know how to give a presentation to an executive team. B, I should be a little bit familiar with what they're presenting on, the politics in the room. There's all sorts of things I should be conscious of given that topic. Is that what you mean?
Yes, but it just sounds to me that there's also something about, I mean, you should know what's going on in the reality, but also, well, let me ask, to what extent do you also then need to know what the outcome looks like, or what good looks like, or
yeah, I should definitely understand what the goal is for their deliverable.
okay.
Is that what you mean?
Yeah, like the standards, or yeah.
Yeah, I need to understand what the deliverable is and what the criteria for success are. Dawn, don't laugh at my grammar.
All right. So is there anything, in order to, because you've now mentioned two things that you need to know. You need to know what they're doing. You need to know what their what good looks like, what the criteria for success are for that particular thing. Is there anything you need to do to be able to determine what your feedback is about?
I don't think there's an application skill here. The application comes later when I deliver the feedback or I prepare the feedback. Right? I'm not sure there's a component in the, unless you want to, unless the analysis itself is a skill. I'm not sure. Is that a skill?
Yeah,
Isn't there a questioning skill here? Isn't there a questioning skill? I mean, you've gone from I see something, and here's what I need to tell them to make them fit the target. But there's like, you may not have all the information about what's going on. So like you need to ask questions to elicit more information. Or do you see that coming later in the process?
Well, secretly that I have that in our feedback process, but I love the idea. I think Rich is right. That would definitely be a skill. I'm just not sure it goes here.
Okay. So
by the way,
Rich,
folks, what are you noticing so far?
Matt,
It's
an easy process. Oops, sorry, Julie.
I was just going to say, Matt, stuck on what you want them to, what you should know, not so much what to do. Mirjam's asked a couple of times and you're still, what do I know?
Maybe I don't know. By the way, I'm not sure I do know at this stage, for real.
Well, exactly. And this is, and somebody just put in a role, it's an iterative process. Exactly. Because I mean, what's happening to Matt happens a lot, right? Which is, we started that discussion in the asynchronous path as well, is that, as when you're really good at something, most of it is tacit, right? It's automated. Like it's really hard for people to articulate what they actually do know. Mindset usually is a bit easier because they say, well, you just need to be open to, or you just need to, so they say things like that. So that's usually a bit easier.
It strikes me, Mirjam, that you have to be very deliberate about the questions that you ask Matt. If you know what you want to get, that the way you ask the question is going to determine how he answers it.
And can you elaborate? Like, do you feel that I knew what I was getting at, or?
I do, but I think, back to Julie's point, I think, and I find this when we're teaching too, is if you ask a question, you don't get the answer that you're hoping for, you have to ask it in a different way that triggers something different in their brain. And I'm just thinking, I mean, that's what strikes me about this process, is that you might have to ask something 4 different ways to actually get what you want.
Yeah, that is definitely true. And also sometimes I think you just need to move on when you notice that they're not able to articulate it. I sometimes just put tacit on the post-it, just and then sometimes later in the process you can when you find out more, sometimes you're able to go back and say, okay, hold on a second, now I wonder if that happens here as well, for example. And I recently did one with someone, and it was about how you do like a root cause analysis workshop with stakeholders. And he said, well, first they go to breakout rooms, la la la. Then they come back, and yeah, that's really easy because you just let them have the conversation between themselves. And I was like, I don't think that's true. You're probably facilitating the discussion. And when I said that, he was like, well, and I said, well, like, how do you then in the end know who brings up the best root cause, for example? And then he was like, oh, that's because you listen for like what kind of evidence they demonstrate. Okay, so you do listen for that, and you do facilitate. And he was like, oh yeah, now that you mentioned that, so you have to like really probe. And yeah,
I also think sometimes you don't need to, if you watch, Mirjam is putting into the categories herself what I say.
Yeah.
And so sometimes if you can just describe for me what you're doing, and then you do the categorization of where they fall. Right? Because if you have to get into a dialogue on, no, I need to know what you do versus what you know. Now you can sometimes just end up derailing the whole conversation.
Yeah, no, that I would, I mean, I would even consider like when you get really familiar with your own template, to take out these, they don't need to know what is what, right? Right. In the end, it's like in the end that is just for you. I mean, I usually work like this, it might catch their eye, but I definitely don't talk about skills or knowledge or mindset. I sometimes use like, what's the mindset that you're in when you're doing that, or are there, so mindset I use sometimes as a term, and tools and templates I definitely just ask for, like, but knowledge and skills I usually don't use these terms when I do this. So Dawn, I'm really intrigued by your approach, because your approach goes against Dick Clark's and Guy Wallace's approach, but I'm pretty sure that there are many different ways you can do this. So because your approach is actually quite aligned with Guy's approach, as in he does it as a group discussion as well, but with more than 2 people, I think. But I would love to know,
well, if you just let me share my screen, if you can make that possible, I'll show you.
Should be done.
This is Ohio State's method that I'm showing you. I can't take credit for it, but it's consistent with the literature. And so what I'm showing you, and I'm sorry, I can't send this to anyone. This is, of course, company confidential information. But the Dacom Institute at The Ohio State University I have a long-term relationship from teaching classes at Ohio State, working at the Center on Education for Training and Employment. So these 2 boxes up here link this task analysis to the duty, to the job of an adult basic literacy education instructor, and then the task. And you notice there's a number and a letter. Any job can have up to 125 different tasks associated with it. So this is completely consistent with what you've just learned. The template is organized differently. And because we're typically doing a whole job with subject matter experts, and we have the same people at the table, I've done a whole pharmaceutical plant. I've done, all different kinds of work and jobs. But here, and this is just an Excel template, first, and we do train them a little bit how to make the distinctions between tasks and knowledge, because we're with them for days and days. And once they catch on, it becomes, because we're doing this in volume, it makes a difference. So first, this first column are the steps required to perform the task, and we typically identify those first. I don't think the content is particularly interesting here. And you can see that the expert workers, there were 3 expert workers that I was sitting with to do this work. The performance standards, we identify that not only at the task level, but also at the step level. So how do you know the task was done correctly? The tools, equipment, supplies, and materials used. Again, when you're doing just feedback, that's one thing. If you're doing a whole job or a whole manufacturing plant, some of the stuff becomes more critical. Required knowledge and skills, and that can include literacy elements, especially if it's going to be used for feed forward into university programs. Safety for some jobs is critical. You know, for example, when I do work, there's a public utility I sometimes work with, and when you're talking about line operators, you have to identify areas in which either their safety or public safety can be impacted. Worker behaviors is an interesting category. This is, again, straight from the Dacom Institute, but the idea that you have to have certain, I'm going to call them attitudinal capabilities. This is a category that's really kind of problematic, but this is how this template works. The decisions that are made, again, step by step. The cues that you would need as a performer to make those decisions.
Yeah, so that goes deeper. Yeah.
Yep. What errors can happen if the task is done incorrectly, the decisions are made incorrectly, or the step is omitted. So this is, again, just a different template, but it's the same information. You're figuring out what the work looks like. And for my purposes in my business, I adapt this template depending on what's important about the work, so that the information that's key for the training we're developing is captured. Something that you don't see here is the rich context provided by the occupational analysis, the job analysis, and some other information that's also gathered before this takes place.
Yeah,
because
because
another example.
This moves toward, or even more like a cognitive task analysis, right? To help to really dive deeper even into, you know, what are the pain points, what do people trip over, like the decision-making points, as you said.
I would use Rob Faucher's template for a cognitive task analysis, just because it digs deeper into those unseen elements.
Right.
But there are different, if you Google, I mean, you can find all different kinds of templates for task analyses and customize. The key is that you're systematically gathering information about the work from the master performers, and that you're gathering the information that you need to include in the training, like the twisty thumb exercise. They will tell you here, oh, you need to tell people, you know, this thumb needs to be on top for the exercise to work. So you're trying to unearth the information that's critical to performance, and not just training people on a topic. Because if you go out to LinkedIn and get the training on feedback, you might not get the linkage that Matt's company is making between how and why they give feedback in a very specific way, and how they feel that's linked to their competitive differentiator and their company culture and all other kinds of things. So that's just something I had to offer today that I thought might be helpful to people.
Yeah, no, this is fantastic. And when I was saying that your approach is different, I was only referring to your comment around the two subject matter experts, because I have seen heated debates between Dick Clark and Guy Wallace about this. And according to Guy Wallace, the group approach works really well, and Dick is against
well,
it.
I'm not recommending a group approach. I would not do more than 2 people, or 3 if it were politically necessary. Guy's PACT process is a panel approach, and so they do, the focus is a little bit different. It's not, I wouldn't call it quite a task analysis, the PACT process. But again, it depends on what your purposes are and the fastest way to get you from A to Z. When you are using a representative panel, we would take the task analysis I showed you, and we would ask other experts to review and comment on it. So in terms of how many people you have at the table, you have to mitigate the risk of getting unique perspectives on the work.
And then you have them to go back to agreement, right? Because it's good if people disagree initially, but in the end they have to.
Well, the organization's a mess when you get your experts at the table and they don't agree at all about what the work looks like, because you have a performance problem then, right? And it's I've done these with groups that there's always some. They need to get into a momentum and agree how they're going to represent the work. So there's always some dissonance there, but if they don't agree why they're doing it, what they're doing, or what good looks like, that's a different kind of problem. Yes. And you need to take a step back and get other people involved to resolve those issues before moving forward with the training. Yes, I'll put the template. I think I can share the template. And again, it's not mine. It's belongs to the DACM International Training Center at The Ohio State University. And I do believe it's in the public domain. So I will share that with everyone on our
site.
If
you just email it to me when you're ready, I'll post it into the session 3 part of the course.
And again, I don't think it's like the best thing since sliced bread. It's just a slightly different. And you need to find your own approaches is what I would recommend.
Can I ask a question here?
Yeah, Hari.
When you do task analysis, and this is a question for you and Mirjam and maybe to Dawn as well. Do you ask the standard way to do this task or the best way according to the master performer? Because I don't know, sometimes you can get 2 different answers.
I would ask about the best way.
Okay.
But I don't know, Dawn, what would you say?
Well, if there's multiple ways to do the work, that's also a problem. I would, you're not taking people to be star performers, you're taking them to the experienced worker standard, if that makes sense. So that's what you're looking for. If there are alternative ways to do the task, you need to get your team to agree which way is the best way to teach your novices to bring them to the experienced worker standard. And if and when you present alternatives to them. Otherwise, it's cognitive overload. You're giving people choice when it doesn't matter.
Yeah, but that's not, so when I said, like I asked for the best way, that's not the end point, but I think you need to understand the best way in order to be able to get to the point what you're pointing out now. Like when you're dealing with a novice, you don't expect them to go to the best way, like necessarily right away. So, but I wouldn't start with the standard either, because I think you do need to understand ideally what best looks like, and then you can maybe,
I agree. But I usually don't find a huge distinction between the way work should be being done by these master performers and the best way. Again, that's a red flag to me.
Hey, I'm sorry, Dawn, I don't want to cut you off, but we are over. And you're welcome to stay a little bit, but I just want to thank everybody for being here, and I think we had a really good discussion, and I think we can continue for another hour talking about this, and we can do so asynchronously. And thank you, Dawn, for sharing your work, very helpful, and I hope to see you online, like in Blinkit, and in about, let me see, 2 weeks or so, we have our Q&A.
2 weeks from Monday.
Yeah.
2 weeks from Monday, we have Paul Kirschner joining us.
Yeah, so then we'll have more Q&A around solutioning. So that should be interesting as well. So thanks again, everyone, and looking forward to the ongoing discussions.
And we did notice a bunch of folks loaded up assignments yesterday or this morning. So we'll work through them this weekend and make sure we get feedback to all of you. So
thanks.
All right, I'm going to stop the recording.